So Lizzie Hjelle here is a graduate student and teaching assistant at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she is currently working towards her master's in library and information science and a master's in women's and gender studies. Her research focuses on representations of minoritized groups in institutional archives and how archival materials can support social justice in institutions. She received her bachelor's in English and Gender, Women's and Sexual Studies from Gustavus Adolphus College in 2017. All right. So, Lizzie, I will hand it over to you.
I'm very excited to be here today talking to you all a little bit more about the role of immigrants in the U.S. suffrage movement. I want to spend some time really looking into some of the intersections and tensions that these women activists experienced during this work. And I couldn't have asked for a better setup to be giving this talk, as Dr. McBride's presentation touched on a lot of really great background that will set us up to have a really good understanding of how immigrants were really active in the Midwest and nationally in this movement. Okay, so before I jump in, I want to take a minute to talk about what does 100 years of the 19th Amendment mean for us here. While the 19th Amendment was really a landmark piece of legislation, it still excluded a lot of groups from gaining the right to vote and a lot of women from gaining the right to vote. Three groups that I've picked out for the purposes of this presentation include Native Americans, Chinese Americans, and African Americans. Many of these groups didn't gain the right to vote until many decades after the 19th Amendment passed in the 1940s, 1960s, and 1970s. I also want to take a moment to recognize that voter suppression is still really alive and well today in the United States as part of a legacy of a lot of the inclusions, exclusions, and rifts that the suffrage movement created early on. And these legacies have a really lasting impact. We see voter suppression still coming through today in oppositions to mail-in voting during a global pandemic. We see this coming through in voter ID laws and the ways that they are being enforced to disproportionately affect Indigenous groups and people of color specifically. We can also see this in reductions of polling places or polling places very far spaced out. It's really eye-opening to look at maps of where polling places are located in relation to marginalized communities. So with all of this in our minds, I want us to start by taking a look and reframing the way that we have maybe thought about feminist history and the activism of historical feminists up until this point. A lot of times we understand feminist history is really happening in three waves, with the first wave, of course, being the suffrage movement. However, when we rely on this wave model to understand feminist history and feminist activism, we're really focusing in on a very specific set of historical actors, namely white middle-class women, to the exclusion of everyone else and all the other activisms that were happening around what these women were doing. So, for the purposes of this presentation, and in order to really render visible a lot of the immigrant activists that were otherwise fairly invisible to the movement and to the way that we have really historicized this movement today, I want us to understand the suffrage movement as one of many intersecting social movements instead of as the be-all, end-all of first-wave feminism. I've isolated three of these movements that I would like us to pay particular attention to today and how they influenced not only the suffrage movement as a whole, but particularly the ways different aspects and different little sectors of the suffrage movement either included or excluded immigrants from their activism and from their overall conversations about what suffrage means and what citizenship means in this country. The first movement, of course, is the abolition movement, which, as we heard from Dr. McBride, really set up a lot of early suffragists in their activism. A lot of them gained experience with organizing through their work in the abolition movement, as well as what it's like to advocate for an unpopular cause. And this really steeled up a lot of major suffragists to tackle the work of suffrage right after the abolition movement. Another really important social movement to keep in our minds analyze the temperance movement. Many suffragists were involved in the temperance movement and vice versa. So this brings us some really important and influential organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Finally, a third social movement that I really want us to pay attention to is the labor movement happening at the same time. The suffrage movement borrowed a lot of tactics from the labor movements, and several activists from the labor movement worked in the suffrage movement as well. Picketing was a big tactic that the labor movement used that suffragists later utilized themselves. And the labor movement really influenced the way suffrage movement did or did not include working class voices in their activism and in their presentations. So these are not the only three social movements that were happening at this time, however, as we also, I'm going to backtrack a second here. I would like us to think of this instead of as a timeline where there's different events happening along it. I want us to think of this as a really complicated Venn diagram, and there's overlaps and also separations between all of these groups. So as we start to really dive into what being an immigrant in the suffrage movement means and what holding this multiplicity of identities means to be an activist at this moment in time, let's keep in mind that this is a really complicated web that we are weaving. And all of these people are coming from different places, and some of them have their fingers in a lot of pies. Okay. So I also want to begin talking about how a lot of these rifts within the suffrage movement started early on, before the suffrage movement was even really gaining tractions. Many of them come from suffragist work in the abolition movement. So rifts really emerged in the abolition movement early on as women were excluded from participation in anti-slavery groups. So what do women do when people don't want to listen to us? We go make our own group instead. So women started their own anti-slavery groups and abolition work. However, a lot of this work was being done by middle-class white women yet again, and they were excluding free Black women from participating in their groups. So free Black women were doubly excluded, both from major abolition groups and from the work of women's only anti-slavery groups. So free Black women eventually formed their own groups as well, two of which include the Manhattan Abolition Society and the Colored Female Anti-Slavery Society. These early rifts that appeared in the abolition movement and the separation along lines of class, race, nationality had a really lasting impact on the way suffragists in the US organized and how they started forming their activist circles. And we can see that many suffrage groups continue to exclude individuals based on their race, ethnicity, class, and religion. I'm sure many of us know the famous story of Ida B. Wells being excluded from the major suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., where she then marched anyway after being told not to, which is amazing, as was a lot of her work at the time. But that many prominent white suffragists attempted to exclude her from such what has now become a really landmark event in the suffrage movement is very telling to how race relations and class relations and ethnic relations worked in other major suffrage groups. So now I want to take a minute to talk about how these specifically anti-immigrant sentiments within the movement came about and what they looked like. So many suffragists had some very nativist ideals that they espoused in a lot of their public speaking. And much of the nativism within the suffrage movement grew out of their racism. And I really want to talk about the way that the suffrage movement relied on gendered nativism in particular. Suffragists often use stereotypes of gender relations in immigrant communities to further their own cause. And we'll talk about this a little later in terms of some prominent suffragists speaking and immigrant activists' reactions to those speeches. Important to note is that immigrants were often depicted within the suffrage movement as being against progressivist reforms. This posed immigrants as a twofold threat in their rhetoric. They are both a threat to the passage of women's suffrage and also a threat to existing reforms. So this really posed immigrants as the ultimate enemy to progress in the suffrage movement. We can see this with two quotes from prominent suffragists that I have pulled out. Many of us are probably familiar with Susan B. Anthony's famous quote, that I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work for or demand the ballot for the Negro, not the woman. We can see this mirrored in some later suffragists as they were writing their own history. Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Schuler noted in their own writings, The Inner Story of the Suffrage Movement in 1923, that there had been hours for the Indian, the Russian, the German, the Chinese, the foreigner, the saloon, hours when each had decided the limits of woman's sphere, but no woman's hour had ever come. We can see in these writings happened even after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Many suffragists still blamed immigrants for their repeated defeats, both on the state and national level. And we'll talk a little bit about more why they found that, why immigrants really took the brunt of this blame as we continue in the presentation. Okay, so I want to take a moment to now talk about specifically immigrants within the movement and how their own intersecting identities really caused them to occupy this space between two disparate groups. Immigrant women in the suffrage movement had a multiplicity of intersecting marginalized identities, and this influenced both their participation within the suffrage movement or their lack of participation in the suffrage movement, as well as their level of acceptance within the movement. And we can see this really coming through on grounds of their ethnicity, their social class, their gender, and of course, religion, which, again, we will get to in a little bit deeper level in a second here, as much of the suffrage movement focused on some religious rhetoric, and many suffragists all shared one religion. Any dissenters tend to get pushed to the margins. This is really important when considering immigrants often shared a different religion than suffragists did. Okay, so now I want to take some time to talk about regional differences in the suffrage movement and how regional differences really impacted the way immigrants were or were not involved in the movement. In the Midwest particular, where I hail from, suffragists tended to draw on pre-existing anti-immigrant sentiments, especially anti-German sentiments exacerbated by World War I. At the later end of the suffrage movement, we can see the shadow of World War I impacting a lot of aspects of the suffrage movement. But even outside of that movement, it is affecting perceptions of specific groups of immigrants even more. We can notice how a lot of German immigrants opposed women's suffrage for two main reasons. One of them being their associations with the temperance movement. A lot of German immigrants at this point were involved in the brewing industry and saw the temperance movement as a threat to their way of life. And also, beer was very important culturally to many of the German immigrants, and they felt that the temperance movement would constitute an attack on that culture that they held in the US. Many German immigrants were also really upset by the nativist rhetoric that suffragists used in their speeches, constructing immigrants as uneducated, backwards, and against a lot of progressivist reforms. We can also see that many Midwestern states actually already allowed male immigrants to vote before officially becoming citizens. Many Midwestern states allowed these male immigrants to vote as long as they had filed their first papers of intent to become citizens, allowing them to vote up to like several years before actually achieving citizenship. And this really angered a lot of suffragists who had been waiting even longer for their own right to vote. This really came to a head in South Dakota in particular when Anna Howard Shaw gave a speech in Yankton County, where she noted, citizenship was a civic responsibility, that the vote was a duty rather than just a right, and that politically active native-born women were more deserving of the franchise than their ignorant male immigrant neighbors. This is especially important in South Dakota for a lot of reasons, as it was one of the Midwestern states that allowed male immigrants to vote so long as they had filed their papers of intent. But when South Dakota eventually passed legislation that allowed women to vote on the state level, that same piece of legislation simultaneously revoked the voting rights of immigrants. So male immigrants could no longer vote after expressing those initial papers of intent. They had to wait for full citizenship. This really deepened that divide, and it fanned the flames of, one, proving that their anti-immigrant sentiment within the suffrage movement was working to get them ahead, but it also really upset the immigrants who had once had the right to vote and then had it thrust away from them while suffragists gained the vote for women in South Dakota. This really started off a big powder keg of suffragist and immigrant relations in the Midwest. So, left to deal with this fallout, we have German immigrant women, women of two countries straddling this divide. Two of which I want to talk about today include Matilda Anneke, who Dr. McBride introduced us to briefly in her presentation, and Claire Naiman. We'll start with Matilda Anneke. So Anneke had previous experience with revolutionary activism in Germany and was held in really high esteem in the German community in the Midwest where she lived. Anneke filled this really important role in both the suffrage movement and her German community as both a literal translator of materials, of translating suffrage materials for the German immigrants and vice versa, but also a translator of ideas in a lot of ways. Anneke did a lot of work trying to reconcile the nativist sentiments that were expressed by a lot of well-known suffragists on their public speaking tours. One prime example of this is in her open letters that she published in response to some criticism that Elizabeth Cady Stanton received about a lecture she gave in La Crosse, Wisconsin in 1869. Elizabeth Cady Stanton expressed some very strong nativist sentiments, and it was a particular anti-German sentiment as well. She showed a cartoon of a German woman yoked alongside an ox in a cart being driven by a German man. And when she was challenged about this claim, Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, "Don't worry, my friend Matilda Anneke can vouch for me that this is the truth and the experience." And this really didn't sit well with a lot of German immigrants in the community and even some other people listening. And it left Anneke in the position to really navigate those troubled waters on behalf of Cady Stanton and to go, well, this isn't exactly what she meant, and to really serve as that translator to both sides, straddling a river of lava in between. And this is really telling of the position of a lot of immigrant activists in the movement. On another hand, we have Claire Naiman. She was also a very well-respected member of the German immigrant community in Nebraska, and she was also well known as a very accomplished public speaker. And she worked mostly to reconcile the differences between advocates and opponents of women's suffrage. And she did this because she had such a high standing in both of these communities. She was able to critique both sides, and she especially critiqued suffragist reliance on religion and temperance during their campaigning, as these were things that were particularly alienating the German immigrant community that she was a part of. I pulled this great quote from her that was published in a German newspaper here in Milwaukee, where I am, where she said, "The majority of the Germans here are only interested in their material prosperity. Their lives circle around dollars and cents, and not to forget about their beloved beer." This was in an 1882 letter that she had written. And I think it is really telling of her status within that community, that she is able to give this kind of critique and have it received well and still be held in such high esteem in both communities really highlights the way that she was, one, very good at straddling that divide between those disparate communities and also had a lot of experience doing so. So this speaks to the strength and the knowledge of these immigrant women in the suffrage movement and how they're really walking through this obstacle course at all times. I want to take a minute before we move on to talk about another region in the United States to look at this fairly famous image of Lady Liberty lighting the way across the United States in terms of women's suffrage, and look at how suffragists are conceptualizing regions in the United States with this image. So as we already know, in the Western United States, many women already enjoyed the right to vote. However, when we see right on the borderlands between those two different parts of the image, we have states like South Dakota, North Dakota, and a lot of the Midwest, where immigrants had the right to vote, but women didn't. And what we can see is when many of these Western states are offering women the right to vote upon moving there, it's really a tactic to entice people to travel and settle further west, along with immigrants. So I want us to really think about this middle ground as a lot more contested than this image makes it seem, and to always remember who is creating these posters and materials and who their audience and what their goals are. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about what the suffrage movement looked like for immigrants in the Midwest, I want to take a second to talk about what this looked like on the East Coast. So we're going to focus in on New York simply because it was a major hub for the suffrage movement, both historically and strategically for the suffragists. It was not only home to many leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Stanton Blatch, it also held the National American Women's Suffrage Organization headquarters, which moved to New York City in 1909. Now, geographically, we already know that some of these major suffrage leaders, because of their status as middle-class women, they were able to travel and spread their ideas a lot further. This looks a little different for many immigrants involved in the movement who do not have the funds or the ability to travel quite so extensively. So we see them more concentrated in the regions where they live than some of these other major players within the movement. This is also important because New York City had a very large and diverse immigrant population at this point. And this particular immigrant population in the city really divided New York State's suffragists. The Women's Suffrage Party formed in New York City in 1909. And it was really important that they chose to form within the city and not in upstate where many of these other suffragists lived, because it showed that there was a willingness there to work with the immigrants in the city and other marginalized groups in a way that the New York State Women's Suffragist Association were not. And this only furthered a rift within the movement that already existed about the acceptance or lack of acceptance of immigrants as an important group to have on their side. So I'd like to point out two particular immigrant activists on the East Coast. And the first one I want to start with is Ernestine Rose. So Ernestine Rose was a Polish immigrant living in New York, and she was also a fairly good friend of Matilda Annika. They had very similar experiences with radical activism in Europe, where Rose was in Poland and Annika was in Germany. And they brought that experience back with them. Despite these women having a lot of similarities, however, Annika was really picked up by the suffrage movement in a way that Rose never was. Rose remained an outsider to the suffrage movement for a myriad of reasons, some of them her own and some of them from intentional exclusion. One being, she had a lot of socialist beliefs and was fairly radical in terms of her politics. She also had freethinker religious views, which, as we talked about earlier, really conflicted with the Christian Protestant views of many of the suffragists. She also was very upset by a lot of the nativist rhetoric being pushed forward by suffragists on their speaking tours. There was a really great conversation that happened between her and Annika, where Annika did a lot of work trying to convince Rose trying to reconcile that nativist rhetoric with another fellow immigrant, Rose. But Rose said she takes these suffragists by the word of their mouths, and she didn't want it translated for her. So this speaks to maybe the feelings of some other immigrants that were a little less like Annika, and that these nativist sentiments and nativist rhetoric had a real impact on how they perceived the movement and whether or not they wanted to be involved with the movement. A second East Coast immigrant activist that I really want to highlight is Dr. Mabel Pinghua Lee, who we can see in the poster that I have here. She actually has a fairly small, but a fairly good digitized collection at the Library of Congress for anyone interested in learning a little bit more about her role in the suffrage movement and in other social movements in the US as well. So Pinghua Lee was a Chinese immigrant active in the New York City suffrage movement. And she also helped to lead the 1912 suffrage parade in New York City when she was just a teenager. She was one of the leaders on horseback, which is really amazing at the time. One, because of her Chinese immigrant status. Two, she was very, very young. Her involvement in the suffrage movement is extra interesting as well, because even with the passage of the 19th Amendment, she would be unable to vote because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which stayed in place until 1943. Despite this, she was heavily active in the movement, and it also speaks to the way many other immigrant activists in the movement were participating and supporting this activism, even though they knew they couldn't necessarily reap the benefits of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Because of this, it is also unknown if she ever became a US citizen and was ever able to vote in the US. Okay, so now that we've gone over a few examples of some of the immigrants who were involved in the movement, I want to take some time to look into some suffragists who were pro-immigrant within the movement. Not all prominent suffragists were anti-immigrant, despite what it may seem from the beginning of my presentation. One important one being Harriet Stanton Blatch, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter. She did a lot of work with working class women, and because of this, interacted with a lot of immigrants as well. She formed the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women in 1907, and she did a lot of work with labor unions and other working class women that were really left behind by the majority middle class suffrage movement. However, she is not without her own problems, as she was also very guilty of utilizing nativist rhetoric in many of her public speeches. Two other activists that I want to highlight for their pro-immigrant mentalities are Jane Addams and Florence Kelley. Both of these suffrage activists also had connections to the labor movement. So that really complicated Venn diagram that we talked about earlier, that's where those are the pies that their fingers are in. And we can see how this influenced all of their activism and their perceptions within the suffrage movement and outside of the suffrage movement as well. Jane Addams is pretty important in that she founded Chicago's Hull House Settlement House, which is one of the most prominent settlement houses in the US, where she worked with many immigrants, which perhaps influenced her opinions about their inclusion in this kind of social movement. She was also a co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union, no small feat. Florence Kelley also has a long string of labor activism accomplishments attached to her name, as well as she helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and she also worked with the National Association for Women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They have so many acronyms. And she did a lot of public speaking within that organization as well. So we can see that she is really floating between multiple movements, and that could be part of where her pro-immigrant sentiments come into play. So to quickly sum up everything that we have gone over today, the three big takeaways that I want us to remember as we think about the role of immigrants within the US suffrage movement. One being that regional differences really impacted the ways that immigrants were involved with the suffrage movement and what that involvement looked like, whether they were working as translators within their communities or whether they were on the front lines at the head of the parade. Regional differences really informed how that activism could take place. The second takeaway I want us to really think about is the ways that their intersecting marginalized identities really impacted the involvement of immigrant women, as well as the ways that their stories have been told and historicized. All of the women who I highlighted for you today do not have cohesive archival collections of their own that you can go in and view. So documentation of their activism, their views, and their accomplishment is really fragmented and scattered all over the place. And this speaks to the ways that those on the margins end up in the historical record, and the ways we have to dig a little deeper to really see their contributions and bring them back to the surface. The third and final takeaway that I want us to remember is that the racism and nativism within the movement ostracized many immigrants early on. And this is a legacy that would impact voting rights for many marginalized groups for decades after the passage of the 19th Amendment and even up and through this day. So as we look back on the history and complications of the suffrage movement and the ways it was maybe less than kind to some of its more marginalized activists and advocates, I want us to consider how this is still happening today and what we can do, well, really what we can do about it as those of us who are in a position to take a look a little deeper and work towards advocating for voting rights for even more people in our country today. And that is all I've got. I want to save time if anyone has any big questions.
Thank you, Lizzie. That was very interesting. I really appreciate that. Well, I do have one question for you, just to kind of get started. Do you have any suggestions? Because you mentioned how we can go forward and try to make a difference today, but do you have any suggestions how people can get started on their own research? Because you do, I know, you're going for library and information studies and work in archives, so you are my expert right now on how people can approach their own archives and where they might be able to get started. And that's also something that I hope everybody takes away from today, is that this will spark their interest, but they'll go and do their own research. So any suggestions?
Oh, I have so many.
Okay.
Primary source research makes my little heart flutter, and it is something I try to instill in all of my students in every class that I teach. If you don't know anywhere else to start, I really recommend starting with the Library of Congress's digital collections. They're accessible from anywhere, and they have done a lot of work to make a lot of really cool primary source material accessible digitally. That being said, also look towards your local historical societies and your state historical societies. I know the Wisconsin Historical Society has many digitized materials available. And even though we are in a global pandemic, I personally know that archivists are working hard to get people access to primary source material that may not already be digitized. Also, a lot of archives and historical societies have social media where they demonstrate a lot of primary source research in their social media posts, especially things like Tumblr, Instagram. I know the UWM archives, where I interned for a couple of years, holds a lot of really cool primary source material on their social media that isn't necessarily available in their digital collections. So it's a really great place to start with some low stakes primary source research.
All right. Well, and then a little bit more on that. So how did you yourself get involved and interested in your research? And I know suffrage specifically isn't necessarily what your current research is on, but if you want to talk a little bit more about that as well.
For sure. As Serena so nicely said as she introduced me, my specific interest is in the way social movements are represented in archives, and really looking for marginalized groups that may not already be represented or may just not be noted in the ways that we would be able to find them, or that the average researcher would be able to find them. So of course, when asked to give a presentation about the suffrage movement, I'm like, all right, whose voices have we not really heard from yet? Because I know they exist. It just takes a lot of time and an experienced hand to dig them out sometimes, which is part of what I want to do long term, in terms of excavating some LGBTQ voices that have previously been buried in archival collections, immigrant voices, and other minoritized groups who we're seeing a real resurgence of interest in the contributions of these groups and the ways that they have really shaped the landscape in our country and beyond. And so I think that primary source and memory institutions have a lot of work to do to dig up the records we have that represent this, to give the people what they want. So for me, a lot of this interest comes from my own work with my local historical society when I was a kid. My grandma was a member, and I remember I thought it was just so cool. Like, little 8-year-old me was in love with all the typewriters everywhere, and really learning about the Indigenous community where I grew up in Minnesota was something that wasn't really touched on in public schools, not a lot of mention of it outside of the historical society. So that's where I first started seeing marginalized voices represented through primary source material, and it, as you can see, completely changed the trajectory of my life. So that's a little bit about where I come into this.
Okay, great. So I've got a question here, actually from Dr. Wagner. So she would like to know if there was any anti-Semitism among suffragists, as was the case for some German suffragists.
Yes. Back to that kind of complicated Venn diagram that I talked about earlier. Suffragists came into the movement with a lot of preconceived beliefs and a lot of stereotypes in particular. We can see anti-Semitism come through in suffrage posters, both from pro and anti-suffrage sides, to be sure. I'm pretty sure it's the Library of Congress that has a really good collection that you can look through and you can see it coming through. I don't know as much about specifics on anti-Semitism within the movement, but I do know it was there and represented as people are flawed And at this time, they had a lot of different beliefs that were being crushed together for a common goal that really resulted in a lot of rifts and exclusion of most marginalized groups in this country.
All right, great, thank you. Got another question. Can you expound on the lacrosse speaker that you talked about?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who gave that speech. And it's really interesting to look at how people were really upset about the nativist rhetoric in that speech, because we have to look at her audience as well. This wasn't just a public speech that was being given. It was at a paid event where people had to buy tickets to attend. And if we are looking at who is, one, willing and able to buy tickets to see a famous suffragist speak, it's not German immigrants, right? Especially at this moment in time in La Crosse, Wisconsin. There's no way they're spending money on that for the most part. So we can see how she really tailored her speech to that audience to draw out those anti-immigrant sentiments that may have already been there, and how she didn't think she would really suffer any consequences for doing that because that was not within her reach. And it was up to Matilda Annika to really navigate that afterwards. She was called out. Cady Stanton and Annika were both called out in a public letter to a newspaper, and that is why Annika published an open letter in response. It's trying to remember the newspaper now. I can't think of it. If I do think of it, I will be sure to say. But it is available in the archives, so it's interesting to see how that kind of discourse that started with a private speech turned into a really public conversation about nativism in Wisconsin.
Interesting. Yeah. And also, just as a side note, there's particular interest in lacrosse, as that is one of the sort of Luxembourg immigrant settlement areas. And of course, a lot of times, recent and Luxembourg immigrants, when they came to the United States, a lot of times they were mistaken as German. Just people weren't aware of a smaller country, or they weren't aware of the Luxembourg language, which may have seemed German to them. So that's something that I wonder is, if Luxembourgers specifically got grouped into that sort of anti-German sentiment.
I would not be surprised. Yes, it adds another layer to that complicated Venn diagram.
Yes, exactly. All right, well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, but thank you so much, Lizzie. We really appreciate you coming here and speaking. And I think I can speak for everyone in that you brought up a lot of good points and interesting things, and I hope that everybody will take your advice and do more research themselves.
I love that. That was really fun.
All right, great. Okay, well, thank you so much. And